So we have something called the reward loop in the brain. And it's usually these screens, these apps, Facebook, social media, all these things know this, and they use this to keep our attention. So what it does is it triggers two things. It triggers D1 and D2, 1 and 2, dopamine receptors. And it's at a rate for a toddler that the developing brain wasn't meant to handle. Heck, I don't even think adults are meant to handle that too, if you ask me. So what ends up happening is that we're overstimulating. It's just a massive stimulation to this area. And the developed brain can't handle that. And so then what happens is they look at, the use it or lose it type of mentality. And this is neurology in a sense and freaking laws of biology in a sense. There's a pruning effect. And they've done research on this, and they looked at this stuff called white matter. So your brain is made up of gray matter and white matter. Okay. And there's a difference between each of those. And what they noticed is in the study is they said that the high screen time in toddlers actually is linked to lower white matter development in areas that are specifically responsible for language and executive function, something known as the prefrontal cortex. So they've looked at the studies, and people have kids who are toddlers who are on a lot of screen time. They will notice that it does affect these two areas. And if you look in my world as a pediatric chiropractor, I see this a lot. I see a lot of more speech delays or pronunciation issues or things like that, especially prefrontal cortex stuff. I'll get a little bit more into that. But so you get this. What happens though is I want you to understand when a kid's looking at a screen, it's a 2D experience, which means just two dimensions. And it's limited. And when it comes to data, because the brain loves complex data, especially when it's developing. Compared to a 3D world where we have tactile feeling, we see things in dimensions, and there's a ton of data that's there, which helps to feed the brain, help it develop and grow for a toddler. So we're minimizing them of this kind of information. And it's going to affect the brain in many different ways. But what happens and what's critical, and this is why you get massive meltdowns too. Remember, I want you to understand this prefrontal cortex is a part of the brain right behind your forehead here. And it's one of the things that as a chiropractor, that's what we work on all day. We're rewiring that to strengthen that. It's part of your executive functions and future planning and impulse control and calmness and this and that. And there's a whole plethora of what it does. And the key component of that, though, is that when we are on something like for a toddler or something like that, where we have massive dopamine spiking, it turns the brakes on to the prefrontal cortex to go offline. And what that does is it leads to impulsivity and lack of focus. Okay. So we get the explosions that come to happen. They've done research on looking at adult brains and noticing that there's a part of the brain right above the ear called the amygdala. And they're noticing that we are having bigger amygdalas than we did before. And one of those part of that brain is impulse, lack of impulse control, more reactivity, more easily to be stimulated in a lot of different ways. The prefrontal cortex is the opposite of that in some way. It does the opposite of that kind of component. And so when you think about this for a developing toddler, what are we doing to their brain to develop? What are we doing to that aspect to where we're teaching their brain to wire more, or I should say less, in the prefrontal cortex, and then it'll start to stimulate more of the amygdala. We'll keep it short for Amy. And that's going to make them become more impulsive. They're going to become more easily stimulated or easily overstimulated and those kind of things. And that, what I just shared right there, is probably about 90% of the kids I saw last year having some sort of overstimulation, easily to be overstimulated, meltdowns, emotional outbursts, behavioral issues. This is all loss or lack of having a strong prefrontal cortex. To understand, this part of the brain does not fully develop to your child's 25 years old. So just understand there's a journey to this. But as I always like to share it, when we're looking at things from a chiropractic lens, it's like, hey, how quick can they pull back to being regulating that nervous system? Because that's what I care about as a chiropractor. I'm looking to say, how can I help that individual, that child, that toddler regulate as best as they possibly can? I'm not expecting it to be perfect because I already know the brain's not developed at the needed. They're a kid. They're just a kid, right? But there are some parameters that we would like to see in that process. So when we can, screens, if we keep having them be on screens over and over and over and over, this is what we're doing to that developing brain.